It all kicks off tonight with an irresistible tale. The life of Arthur Basil Hawthorne, the 41 Prime Minister of Britannia. Born into a family that owned half of everything worth owning, Arthur was no stranger to wealth, but hardship was his shadow from the start. From scrawny days, confined to bed with frail lungs, to standing defiant in the face of a looming apocalypse, Arthur's story is more than a political yarn. It's a window into one of the most mysterious and mythic lives of the last century. Before we start the deep dive, do yourself a favor. Pour yourself a cup of something strong. Tell us where on earth you're tuning in from. And maybe let us know if you've got socks on, because tonight's tale will make you want to kick them off. Now, settle in. Turn down the lights and crank up the volume. Let's see what our friend Arthur's life was really like. Arthur Basil Hawthorne first opened his eyes on June 1918, in the posh riverside neighborhood of Westmere-on-the-Thames, nestled in the heart of Old Britannia. He was the second son of Richard Hawthorne, a financial titan with a penchant for collecting antique maps and rare whiskeys, and Eleanor Nell Fitzgerald, whose laughter could fill a ballroom even on her worst day. With a lineage that screamed power and privilege, everyone assumed Arthur's life would be charmed from the get-go. But they were wrong. Arthur's childhood was a turbulent dance between the promise of grandeur and the reality of brittle bones and constant fevers. From the tender age of 3, when he nearly succumbed to scarlet fever, to countless spells of pneumonia and odd ailments that left doctors scratching their heads, Arthur became an unwilling expert on the sterile smells of hospitals and the lonely hush of sick rooms. Yet he never let illness define him. While other children played in fields, Arthur found refuge in book tales of ancient knights, cunning tricksters, and forgotten empires. He devoured them all, line by line, as though each story was a secret door out of his confinement. Life in the Hawthorne household was anything but calm. Richard Hawthorne was a man who measured success in pound sterling and political connections. When he wasn't orchestrating complex financial deals, he was mapping out his children's futures like a general laying siege. Arthur's elder brother Lionel was the golden boy, robust, athletic, and already an expert at charming any room he entered. Arthur, on the other hand, was thin as a reed, with a sharp tongue and sharper Mindowit honed to cut through the noise of a house that never stopped planning. At school, Arthur was both a mystery and a magnet. He never made it to the top of the class she's health saw to that, but he left a mark on every teacher with his wry observations and uncanny ability to see through nonsense. Lionel might have been the family's pride, but Arthur was the one whose humor could silence a room or set it alight. Classmates whispered that he had a knack for turning every setback into an adventure, every failure into a story worth telling. By the time the world stumbled into the 1930s and the drums of war began to rumble, Arthur had already learned that true strength wasn't about muscles, or Medalcet was about endurance. He'd finished at Eton with middling grades, but an exceptional reputation for debates that left teachers shaking their heads and competitors shaking in their boots. He moved on to Oxford, where he wrote a thesis that would eventually be published as Why the Empire Yawns, a biting critique of Britannia's complacency as storms gathered on the continent. While most of his privileged peers were polishing their accents for diplomatic posts or cozy academic chairs, Arthur had other plans. His body might have been a collection of aches and creaks, but his mind was ready for battle. Using the family name as leverage, Arthur secured a spot in the Royal Naval Reserve. Many thought it was madness. He was more suited to libraries than combat. But Arthur didn't want to watch the world burn from a safe distance. He wanted to feel the heat on his skin, to carve his name into history. So it was that in the summer of 1942, Lieutenant Hawthorne found himself on the windswept decks of the HMS Tempest, a sleek destroyer tasked with patrolling the jagged edges of the Mediterranean. With a battered spine and lungs that had never quite forgiven the years of illness, Arthur was an unlikely sailor. But he had something even more potent, a refusal to be underestimated. On a moonless night in November, the Tempest was ambushed by an enemy cruiser lurking in the darkness. A thunderous impact ripped through the hull, sending Arthur and his crewmates into the black, icy sea. 2 men were gone in an instant, swallowed by the night. The rest clung to splintered wood and the faint promise of survival. Here, in the cold maw of the sea, Arthur's legend was forged. He refused to be just another casualty of history. With a rope clenched between his teeth, he hauled a wounded comrade through the frigid waters. Every stroke of his arms a silent defiance of the pain that threatened to drown him. For 3 long miles they swam, the sea's cold fingers tugging at their limbs, until they reached the jagged cliffs of a lonely island. For 6 days, Arthur led his battered band through a maze of thorny scrub and ghostly echoes of ancient battles. They lived on coconuts and brackish water, their nights haunted by distant gunfire and the uncertain promise of rescue. When the Navy finally found them, Arthur was gaunt and feverish, but his eyes burned with a ferocious light. For his courage, Arthur was awarded the Silver Cross of Britannia, but the medal was merely a trinket compared to what he had gained, a certainty that he could stare death in the face and not blink. The sickly boy was gone, replaced by a man who understood that survival was an act of will, not luck. Returning home as a celebrated hero, Arthur was thrust into a whirlwind of parades and interviews. Everywhere he went, people wanted to shake his hand, to bask in the reflected glow of his quiet defiance. But Arthur had no interest in being a paper hero. He was already looking to the future he was determined to shape on his own terms. In the bustling salons of London, Arthur became a legend in more ways than one. He'd learned the fine art of political persuasion during those long days of convalescence, and now he turned that same charm on the corridors of power. Unlike Lionel, who could win a room with his dazzling grin, Arthur used humor like a rapier, puncturing egos and deflating pomposity with a single wry comment. Evenings at Hawthorne House became gatherings of the sharpest minds in Britannia writers, war correspondents, and philosophers arguing late into the night over brandy and the crackle of the fire. Arthur relished it all, spinning stories of his days at sea and poking fun at the stuffed shirts who thought themselves untouchable. Through it all, he never lost the edge of the boy who'd once measured life in library books and hospital bed days. He understood that charm could be armor, and laughter could be a weapon as fierce as any blade. As the world shifted into the post-war years, Arthur's political star began to rise. His health still faltered, at times a reminder that even the strongest will can't banish every ghost, but he refused to let it slow him down. When he finally took the office of Prime Minister in 1955, he did so with the calm confidence of a man who had already stared down death and come back grinning. Arthur Basil Hawthorne, the boy who had once lain awake listening to the rasp of his own breath, who had wrestled with his own body as much as he had with the world around him. His story was never about a life of ease. It was about the grit to stand up when everything else said stay down, the wit to cut through the noise, and the courage to claim a future no one thought he'd ever see. So here's to Arthur. Here's to the second sons, the underdogs, the ones who learn to find strength in every setback. Because in the end, it's not the medals or the titles that matter. It's the stories we leave behind, and the stubborn, beautiful fact that some of us refuse to be forgotten. Journalists couldn't get enough of Arthur Basil Hawthorne's steely bravery, and the public? Well, they fell head over heels for his effortless grace and sharp profile. Meanwhile, his father, Richard Hawthorne, a master of quiet scheming, wasted no time sniffing out opportunity. If Lionel, the elder brother, had once been the family's golden plan, Arthur was now the unstoppable force of destiny. The great political wheel began to turn once more, this time with Arthur right at the center. When Arthur returned from the war in 1946, he brought back more than the ceremonial medals pinned to his chest. He carried with him the weighty air of a man who had stared into the abyss and come back tempered, wiser. His health still wavered like a half-mended ship's mast in a gale, but his presence was undeniable. Even Richard, the patriarch who saw the world as one grand chessboard, knew that the time had come. Britannia was rebuilding, and the people were starved for fresh faces and new voice heroes they could rally behind. In that hopeful year, Arthur launched his political career, running for Parliament in the newly redrawn district of Eastwood, a once-forgotten patch of the industrial Midlands. He was only 30 young by any political standard, so most of the old guard assumed he'd ride on little more than the coattails of the Hawthorne name and the family coffers. But Arthur had other plans. He threw himself into the campaign with the energy of a man who'd been caged too long. He shook every hand he could find, toured the mills and mines, and spoke to dock workers and housewives alike. He made them laugh. He made them think. And it wasn't the money that won them over, nor the war medal. It was the unmistakable spark in his eyes, a mixture of kindness and fierce purpose that was impossible to fake. He won. Of course, won handily. Some said shockingly. Stepping into Parliament in an era when Britannia was still reeling from the weight of empire and the memory of ration books, Arthur quickly proved he wasn't there to sit quietly at the back of the chamber. His speeches were like quicksilver, part wit, part conviction, and all razor-sharp. He refused to parrot party lines. Instead, he asked uncomfortable questions and challenged stale orthodoxies. His words, a clarion call that both rattled the old guard and woke up the young dreamers. For 6 years, Arthur learned the brutal ballet of politics: when to speak, when to sit, and when to vanish behind a polite smile that said more than words ever could. But even as he navigated the endless committees and the fog of Westminster's corridors, he was already charting his next move. In 1952, he turned his sights on the House of Lords itself, challenging Baron Alistair Farncombe, a wily conservative who'd held his seat since Arthur was in short trousers. The race was a veritable slugfest. Money poured in, family members canvassed tirelessly, and the newspapers buzzed like flies at a banquet. Arthur's sisters, especially the irrepressible Clementine, took to the campaign trail with a gusto that left the Farncombe camp reeling. And behind it all, Richard orchestrated a media blitz, the likes of which Eastwood had never seen. Pamphlets, posters, radio spots crackling with Arthur's confident baritone. In the end, Arthur triumphed, unseating Farncombe and stepping into the upper chamber with a wry grin that said he had no intention of being just another title in a dusty ledger. But triumph in public did not mean peace in private. Arthur's health had always been a precarious dance. In the shadows, he battled an adrenal disorder that left him sapped of energy and a back so wretched it seemed determined to snap him in half. Risky spinal surgeries left him at death's door more than once, but the public never saw the grim reality. The carefully crafted Hawthorne mystique was all anyone ever glimpsed: photogenic smiles and stirring speeches, no hint of the daily agony that lurked behind the polished facade. Still, Arthur's star kept climbing. His speeches rang with national ambition, each one more stirring than the last. He was charming, eloquent, and just roguish enough to keep people guessing. The literati adored him. The public couldn't get enough of his fresh approach to old problems. When he released a book profiles, an Audacity critics swooned, and the bookshops couldn't keep up with the demand. Arthur had become the man everyone wanted to see and hear. Yet behind the scenes, his mind was already fixed on the next horizon, the highest office in the land. By the late 1950s, Arthur was no longer just a name in Parliament. He was a presence, a force. And he knew that Britannia needed a new leader, someone to jolt the establishment out of its rut of dusty tradition. He announced his candidacy for Prime Minister in 1960 at the audacious age of 42. Skeptics clucked their tongues. He was too young, too untested, too unorthodox. And then there was his heritage, his mother's Irish roots, which still ruffled feathers in some of the kingdom's more buttoned-up drawing room. Britannia had never had a prime minister with such a background, and old prejudices stirred uneasily in the corners of polite society. Arthur, ever the tactician, didn't shy from it. Instead, he leaned into the storm, standing on podiums in drafty halls and declaring, "I am not the Irishman's candidate, I am the people's candidate. My mother's laughter and my father's ambition have nothing to do with the fact that I am ready to lead." The campaign was a masterstroke of modern flair. Gone were the fusty leaflets and dusty speeches of years past. Arthur's team understood the power of imagery, how a well-placed camera could capture not just a man, but a movement. And on television, Arthur was a revelation. His humor cut through the static. His easy manner turned every room into an intimate conversation. His chief opponent, the seasoned but dour Chancellor Marcus Redwood, had the gravitas of an ancient oak and the warmth of a winter frost. Redwood knew how to play the game in smoky backrooms, but Arthur knew how to play to the camera. And Britannia was watching, no longer content to read about debates in the morning paper, but glued to flickering black and white screens that broadcast every nuance, every spark of charisma. The first live televised debate was the tipping point. Redwood fidgeted and sweated under the bright lights, his brow furrowed as though every word was dragged from his soul with tongue. Arthur, on the other hand, sat at ease, his half-smile conveying that he was both utterly serious and entirely unflappable. For the first time, Britannia wasn't just listening, they were seeing. And what they saw was a leader. The election was a nail-biter, with enough twists and turns to fill a Shakespearean tragedy. In the end, Arthur's blend of charm and tenacity carried him over the finish line, making him the youngest prime minister in Britannia's modern history. Yet even in victory, the weight of expectation was clear in Arthur's eyes. He had fought not just to win, but to prove that a sickly boy with more books than brawn could stand at the helm of an empire's twilight and turn it toward a new dawn. So, there you have it, the story of Arthur Basil Hawthorne, a man who refused to be sidelined by illness, who turned every flaw into a badge of honor, and who reminded a weary kingdom that sometimes the most unlikely of men are the ones who rise to greatness. The ballots were still warm when Arthur Basil Hawthorne emerged victorious in the national election of November 1960, a race so close, it felt as though the entire kingdom was holding its breath. At just 43, he became the youngest prime minister in Britannia's long history, and the first man of Irish Catholic descent to ever claim the highest office in the land. The grand halls of Parliament echoed with the buzz of a new era as throngs of supporters spilled into the cobblestone streets outside. On a biting January morning in 1961, the air crackled with possibility as Arthur took the oath of office on the steps of Parliament Hall. Wrapped in a heavy wool coat and flanked by his wife Lucille, he spoke words that would become immortal in the years to come. Ask not what the realm can do for you, but what you can do for the realm. To many, it felt as if the kingdom itself had taken a deep breath and exhaled a promise of reinvention. The Hawthorne administration soon earned the moniker Avalon, a nod to the mythical island of Arthurian legend, filled with shining knights and whispered dreams. The name fit for a while. The new prime minister and his inner circle exuded the kind of youthful energy and sly charm that had become scarce in the gray years following the war. But beyond the shining smiles and clever speeches, Arthur faced challenges that would have tested even the most battle-hardened leader and the world was watching. From the moment he crossed the threshold into his new office, Arthur realized that the campaign's easy banter was a far cry from the weight of the crown. Within 3 months, his resolve would be tested in a debacle that would stain his early days with humiliation. The plan he'd inherited from the previous chancellor's cabinet seemed sound on parchment. Train a group of exiled dissidents to storm the shores of Carthona, a rebellious island just 90 miles from Britannia's borders, and oust the fiery revolutionary leader, Hector Duval. It was meant to be a quick and quiet affair, a shadow war that wouldn't leave fingerprints. But the reality was a spectacular fiasco. On April 17, 1961, the Operation Iron Goal invasion commenced and dissolved like mist in the morning sun. Duval's forces had been tipped off. The local population didn't rise in support as predicted, and the promised air cover was conspicuously absent sacrificed in a bid to maintain plausible deniability. Within days, the ragtag army of exiles was either dead or captured, and Britannia's reputation for precision and power lay in tatters. The press had a field day. They turned Arthur's misstep into a cautionary tale of cartoons of him as a fumbling schoolboy clutching a toy sword filled the papers. Allies wavered, enemies snickered, and for the first time, the young prime minister's polished exterior began to show cracks, at least behind closed doors. In the privacy of his chambers, Arthur raged at the intelligence bureau, at his advisors, and at his own trusting instincts. He had signed off on the plan, after all, and now the full weight of its failure rested squarely on his shoulders. But here, in the ashes of humiliation, Arthur began to forge a different kind of strength. Rather than shuffle, blame, or vanish behind the rhetoric of excuses, he stepped into the harsh glow of accountability. "Success has 1,000 fathers," he declared in a televised address, his voice calm but resolute. "But failure is an orphan, and I will claim this one as mine." To the surprise of everyone, including himself, the kingdom didn't turn on him. In fact, his approval ratings crept higher. The people respected the honesty and the willingness to own a misstep. He had stumbled, but he stood up again, and that counted for more than perfection ever could. Still, the ghosts of Operation Iron Goal never truly left him. They haunted every meeting with generals and spy masters, every intelligence briefing in the dead of night. Arthur grew wary of quick fixes and the easy confidence of men in uniform. He knew now that decisions made behind oak doors could ripple outward with terrifying speed, and the next time, there might be no room for second chances. The next test of his resolve was not long in coming. In October 1962, Britannia found itself staring straight down the barrel of annihilation. A series of grainy aerial photographs, captured by high-flying reconnaissance planes, revealed that the Empire of Ruslav was installing long-range nuclear missiles on the cliffs of Carthona, those same jagged shores that had become Arthur's personal nightmare. The missiles, once operational, could flatten Britannia's cities in the blink of an eye. The stakes were no longer mere headlines or parliamentary seats, they were the very breath of the realm. Arthur convened the Council of 12, a secretive inner circle of military minds, political strategists, and a few trusted civilians. The generals roared for immediate airstrikes, their fingers itching for the quick solution. Others counseled caution, warning that one miscalculation could tip the entire world into a firestorm of mushroom clouds. Arthur said little in those first tense hours, but he listened. He remembered the lessons of the Iron Gulf fiasco, how easy it was to be led down the wrong path by certainty and arrogance. Instead of bombs, he chose a blockade, though he called it a quarantine to avoid the ugly legalities of war. Britannian ships would circle the island like silent wolves, warning off any Ruslavian vessels daring to slip through. For 13 days, the world seemed to teeter on a knife's edge. In London's crowded bomb shelters, mothers whispered lullabies to children who might never see another sunrise. In the icy reaches of the Ruslavian steppe, bombers sat ready, engines idling like beasts in the dark. Britannia's armed forces shifted to DEFCON 2-1, heartbeat away from a final war. Arthur walked the tightrope with a calm face for the cameras projecting confidence and iron resolve, but in the lonely hours of the night, he battled the weight of each decision like a man wrestling his own shadow. Every hour brought new telegrams, new intelligence, each one a puzzle piece that might spell the difference between peace and ruin. He met with Lucille in those late hours, and she alone saw the toll etched in the lines at the corners of his mouth. "You look like you're aging by the hour," she teased softly one night as she poured him a glass of brandy. He managed a weary smile. "I think the world's trying to catch up with me." Finally, after days of brinkmanship, the tension broke. Ruslavian Premier Andrei Volkov blinked first, agreeing to dismantle the missile sites in return for a quiet promise that Britannia would never attempt another invasion of Carthona's rocky shores. The kingdom exhaled in relief, and once more, Arthur had walked them back from the abyss. The crisis cemented Arthur's image as a leader of rare steel, someone who could hold the line not just with force, but with reason. In public, his speeches after the crisis were stirring, but never triumphalist. "Peace," he told a packed parliament, "is not a trophy to be seized, but a delicate garden that must be tended with care and vigilance." But behind that calm facade, Arthur knew how close the kingdom had come to ruin. In those sleepless nights, he had come to understand that leadership in the nuclear age was a balancing act where every misstep could topple the world. And he vowed, in the privacy of his own heart, never to let fear or hubris drive him blindly again. Arthur Basil Hawthorne had stepped into the pages of history with the weight of centuries on his shoulders, but he carried it all with the quiet conviction of a man who had learned, through fire and failure, that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about how you rise, again and again, no matter how hard the world tries to keep you down. Millions held their breath as the world teetered on the brink. Then, in a series of whispered messages carried not by diplomats but by trusted intermediaries, Premier Alexei Volkov of the Ruslavian Federation made a fateful offer. Ruslav would dismantle its missiles from the island of Carthona if Britannia, in turn, pledged publicly never to invade the island again and agreed in secret to remove their own missile batteries from the rocky cliffs of Anatolia. Arthur Basil Hawthorne weighed the deal like a man balancing a bomb in his hands. He agreed. And so the crisis that had threatened to incinerate half the planet was diffused, not through thunderous speeches or bombs dropped in fury, but through a careful handshake in the shadows. The missiles disappeared, the dread lifted, and the story of the Carthona missile crisis was forever seared into the chronicles of history, not as a tale of fiery conquest, but as an example of measured wisdom. In the aftermath, both Britannia and Ruslav installed a direct link between their capitals, a line that buzzed softly from Arthur's office to Volkov's Kremlin sanctuary. It was dubbed the Hotline, but it felt more like a lifeline, a thin thread of reason spun across a world bristling with suspicion. Arthur, for his part, emerged not merely as a shrewd tactician, but as a leader reborn. He had peered into the chasm of annihilation and had managed to lead his kingdom and, in a way, the entire world back from the edge. Yet, in the quiet aftermath, he also understood a chilling truth. The missiles had vanished, but the clock had not stopped ticking. Humanity had come closer to oblivion than most would ever realize, and that knowledge sat heavy on Arthur's shoulders like a lead crown. After Carthona, Arthur's focus turned inward. The realm was safe for now, but the kingdom itself was still riven by old injustices and new hopes. He turned his attention to the simmering cauldron of inequality and civil unrest. determined to forge a new path that would outlast the fleeting glories of foreign victories. In the last year of his leadership, Arthur threw himself into the cause of equality, what he called his second horizon. The struggle for racial justice had been swelling like a summer storm, and by 1963, it had broken loose in fury. Across the southern marches, the ancient stain of segregation clung like ivy to old stones, and peaceful demonstrators found themselves met not with reason, but with snarling dogs and water cannons. Arthur had once been cautious, too cautious, some said. He had feared alienating the entrenched landholders of the southern marches, but those fears evaporated in the face of mounting violence and the blood of innocents. When soldiers had to be dispatched to pry open the gates of segregated universities, and when the fearless activist Malcolm Evers was cut down in a hail of bullets, Arthur could no longer stand aside. On June 11, 1963, he addressed the kingdom in a televised speech that crackled with purpose. "This is not merely a political question," he declared in his measured, deliberate voice. "It is a moral question. It is as old as the ancient chronicles and as clear as the Magna Carta itself." For the first time, a prime minister had spoken not just of policy, but of conscience. And across Britannia, in drawing rooms and dimly lit pubs, people felt the weight of his words settle in their bones. That same summer, Britannia watched in wonder as 250,000 citizens gathered at the steps of the Grand Parliament to demand equality. It was the March of Hope, and in the heat of that day, Dr. Marcus King gave his soaring "I Have a Dream" oration, weaving his vision of a realm unbound by ancient prejudices. Afterward, Arthur met with Dr. King in a quiet room away from the crowd. Their conversation was brief, but the impact was profound. Arthur, ever aware of the political perils, nonetheless threw the weight of his office behind the movement. Even as he championed civil rights, Arthur's gaze lifted to other horizons. He became a vocal advocate for exploration beyond the realm itself, declaring with infectious conviction that Britannia would send an explorer to the moon before the decade's close. "This is not just about rockets or rivalries," he insisted. "It is about the spirit of discovery, the proof that a free people can dream not just of what is, but of what might be." Behind the grand speeches and the infectious optimism, Arthur's own body was betraying him. Years of pain had left their mark, though the public saw only the easy smile and the confident stride. In private, he leaned on Lucille's arm more often than he let on, his back a constant agony, his breath sometimes shallow as he read briefing after briefing late into the night. But Arthur pressed on, driven by a belief that time, his time, everyone's time, was a precious currency, never to be squandered. His new horizon was still just beginning to reveal itself, and he was determined to see it through. Yet fate, with its own plans, waited for no one. On a bright November morning in 1963, Arthur arrived in the bustling city of South Stop on a whirlwind tour to shore up support for the upcoming election. The visit was meant to be a formality. Handshakes with shopkeepers, quick speeches to factory workers, and a motorcade that would snake through the heart of the city. Lucille was by his side in the back of an open-top carriage, her smile as radiant as the autumn sun. The city greeted them like returning royalty. Children waved homemade flags. Workers spilled out of storefronts, eager for a glimpse of their young, vigorous prime minister. Arthur, ever the showman, stood to wave, his face open and unguarded, the very picture of hope and possibility. But hope is a fragile thing. As the motorcade turned past the Southmere Depository, a sudden crack split the air. In an instant, the cheers turned to gasps, then to screams. Lucille turned, eyes wide, as the first bullet found its mark, a sickening bloom of red against the Prime Minister's crisp collar. A second shot followed, and chaos erupted. The carriage lurched forward as security scrambled to react, but it was too late. Lucille cradled her husband's head in her lap, her face a mask of shock and horror, as she whispered his name over and over, as if saying it could bring him back. Around them, the crowd dissolved into frantic confusion. Sirens wailed. The bright, hopeful day was over. The story of Arthur Basil Hawthorne would not end in a grand hall of Parliament or on the lunar plains he dreamed of reaching. It ended in the back of an open carriage, beneath a sky that had seemed impossibly blue just moments before. The realm was left in stunned silence, and in that silence, the fragile echo of Arthur's promisto pushed beyond fear, to stand for justice, to reach for the stars lingered on. The final shot struck Arthur Basil Hawthorne in the head, and he crumpled forward into Lucille's trembling arms. The carriage raced to St. Hilaire's Hospital, sirens wailing through Southmere's cobbled streets, but the wounds were too grave to mend. At 1:00 p.m., Arthur Basil Hawthorne was pronounced dead. He was only 46. Back in Britannia's capital, the entire kingdom fell into a stunned hush. In town squares and bustling markets, people wept openly, their grief a raw wound in the cold winter air. Schools fell silent, shopkeepers pulled down their shutters, and the grand halls of Parliament echoed with a profound sense of loss. It was as if the very soul of the realm had been torn from its moorings. The young leader who had spoken of stars and justice, who had promised a new dawn, was gone in an instant. Hours later, in the claustrophobic cabin of the Royal Airship Lionheart, Deputy Prime Minister Gregory Lonsdale took the oath of office. Lucille stood at his side, her elegant dress stained dark with her husband's blood, her face set in an expression of quiet fury and defiance. "I want them to see what they've done," she reportedly whispered to an aide who offered her a clean cloak. In that single, chilling sentence, the enormity of the day was laid bare. The accused assassin, a drifter named Lionel Miles, was seized within hours, a solitary figure with a sullen grin and 1,000 mysteries in his eyes. But before he could speak a word in his defense, he too was silenced, gunned down in a police station by a nightclub proprietor named Victor Dane, lived before a stunned crowd of reporters. Conspiracy theories bloomed like weeds in the cracks of truth. Was it the Ruslavians? The Intelligence Bureau? The powerful trade barons who'd watched Arthur's star rise too fast? Decades later, the shadows still cling to that day. The full story elusive, the speculation endless. What is certain is the loss. Arthur's funeral became a moment of national grief unlike any other. Envoys and monarchs from every corner of the world marched in solemn procession through the rain-slicked streets. A lone, riderless horse, hooves striking sparks on the cobblestones, led the way. And in the quiet hush of St. Ilara's Cathedral, the youngest of Arthur's sons, little Ilara, raised his small hand in salute to his father's casket, a gesture that would echo through the ages. The Avalon dream had ended that day in Southmere. Britannia, and the world beyond, seemed to stop with it. In the years that followed, Arthur's life passed from mere history to something closer to legend. The man who had walked the halls of Parliament with a half-smile and a gleam of mischief became a symbol, a beacon of youth, of hope, of all the promises that fate had stolen away in the echo of gunfire. His time as Prime Minister had been heartbreakingly short, just over 1,000 days, but those days left an imprint that refused to fade. For many, Arthur is remembered first not for his policies or the countless drafts of legislation he pored over in the midnight hours, but for his words that transcended politics to become calls to action. His famous challenge? "Ask not what the realm can do for you, but what you can do for the realm," was no longer a phrase. It became a rallying cry that spanned generations. In those simple words, Arthur turned the notion of service from duty to honor, and countless Britannians found in them the courage to do more than simply exist. In foreign affairs, Arthur's greatest triumph wasn't a conquest or a treaty. Inked in some gilded chamber, it was his refusal to be swept up by the drums of war. When the Carthona missile crisis threatened to shatter the world into dust, he chose reason over fury, restraint over empty bravado. That choice, whispered some, may have saved the world itself. His careful diplomacy paved the way for future arms treaties, brief flickers of calm in the long shadows of the Cold War. And his dream of reaching for the heavens off, sending Britannians beyond the blue horizon, would bear fruit long after his death. In 1969, as the world watched breathlessly, Britannia's first astronaut planted a flag on the lunar soil, and the radio crackled with a single name, Hawthorne. Even in the silent seas of the moon, his vision was alive. At home, his legacy was more complicated. The civil rights legislation that he championed in his final year would only be fully realized by his successor, Lonsdale, who signed it into law with a somber nod to Arthur's unfinished fight. But it was Arthur who had broken the silence, who had declared to a divided realm that justice was not a privilege but a birthright. He had changed the tone of the national conversation, an act of courage in its own right. Perhaps, though, Arthur's most enduring legacy lies not in treaties or acts of parliament, but in the man he was. The young leader whose easy laugh and iron resolve showed that leadership could be both intelligent and deeply human. He was the father who played tag with his children on the manicured lawns behind Parliament, the husband who stole kisses from Lucille in quiet corners, the leader who bore chronic pain with a grin that said, I'm still here." His life was cut short violently, senselessly, but his light burned so brightly that it refused to be snuffed out entirely. In the hushed moments after his death, Britannians found themselves asking a single, haunting question. What if? What if he had lived to see his plans come to full bloom? What if he had seen the moon landings, the expansion of rights, the easing of tensions that he had once nurtured? That question lingers still, a gentle ache in the nation's collective memory. Today, Arthur Basil Hawthorne's name is etched in brass plaques on library walls and whispered in school assemblies where children recite the words that once lit a fire in their grandparents' hearts. His face gazes out from coins, postage stamps, and towering portraits in Parliament's halls. But his true monument is carved not in stone, but in the idea he championed that in a world too often driven by fear and cynicism, there is room for intelligence, courage, and the unyielding belief that tomorrow can be brighter. He left behind more than a kingdom in mourning. He left behind a promise that sometimes the briefest blaze of light can burn the longest in our memories. The story of coffee's spiritual awakening begins not with the polite hiss of a modern espresso machine, but in the shadowed hills of ancient Abyssinia, what we now call Ethiopia. Legend has it that a mischievous goatherd named Kelemu noticed something peculiar in his flock. His goats, after nibbling the glossy red berries of a certain wild shrub, began to leap and twirl with a frenetic energy, as though possessed by some capricious mountain spirit. Curiosity got the better of him, as it often does with such tales. Kelemu plucked a handful of berries and, with the reckless abandon of a man who'd never read a cautionary tale, chewed them himself. The result? A sudden rush of clarity and an electric jolt of wakefulness that rattled him to the bone. Whether Kelemu existed or was simply a figment of the human need for myth, scholars agree on one thing. The humble shrub that had so thoroughly enchanted him was the wild ancestor of Coffea arabica. For centuries, the people of the highlands didn't brew coffee as we do today. Instead, they chewed the berries raw or mashed them with animal fat into a kind of primitive energy batia, mountain men's fuel for long treks and cold nights. It was a far cry from the rich brews that would one day dominate breakfast tables across the world. From these misty slopes, coffee's journey began in earnest. Traders carried it across the narrow throat of the Red Sea to the sun-bleached lands of the Arabian Peninsula, where it found new purpose in the fervent rituals of Sufi mystics. By the 15th century, in the windswept port cities of Yemen, coffee had been reborn, roasted, ground, and brewed into a dark elixir called kawa. It no longer merely staved off hunger or fatigue yet unlocked doors to the divine. In the dimly lit halls of Yemen's Sufi lodges, the rhythmic chants of midnight prayers were punctuated by the earthy fragrance of coffee. This was no idle drink, it was a companion on the winding road to enlightenment. Kawa was both ritual and rapture, a bridge between the mundane and the mystical. From Yemen, coffee's rich aroma drifted northward. Caravans ferried the beans to the ancient cities of Mecca, Medina, and Cairo places, where faith and commerce danced together in the crowded bazaars. Here, the drink took on a new role, a spark for conversation and a tonic for thought. Coffee houses dubbed Kabakana sprang up in every quarter. They were more than mere vendors of a hot beverage. They were incubators of poetry, music, and fiery debate. In the glow of lanterns and the swirl of incense, men discussed philosophy, politics, and the endless mysteries of life, their voices rising and falling like the tide. Nowhere did this culture of coffeehouses burn more brilliantly than in Istanbul, the beating heart of the Ottoman Empire. By the 16th century, the city's streets were lined with establishments that rivaled palaces in opulence. Intricate tiles gleamed in the flickering light, musicians played lilting melodies, and artists sketched patrons locked in passionate debate. Here, coffee was not merely drunk, it was worshipped. The Ottomans, with their flair for refinement, transformed the humble brew into an art form. Roasting techniques became as secretive as statecraft. Brewing rituals evolved. A perfect cup was a delicate dance of fire and water, patience and precision. Coffee pots called sez became household relics, cherished as much as heirloom. Yet, with every sip of enlightenment came a ripple of fear. Religious leaders, wary of the drink's heady influence, warned of its perils. Coffee, they argued, quickened the mind and stirred the soul, inviting sedition and heresy. At times, coffee houses were shuttered under edicts of moral panic, accused of harboring subversive plots in the corners of shadowed alcoves. But even kings are powerless to quell the restless stir of thought. Despite these bans, coffee's allure could not be contained. Patrons smuggled beans in hidden pouches and brewed in the hush of night. Eventually, even the sultans themselves could not resist. To serve coffee to a guest became a mark of both respect and hospitality, and the drink seeped into the empire's bones like a sweet, dark secret. For centuries, the Arab world held coffee as a closely guarded treasure. Yemeni traders, wise to the plant's growing power, exported only roasted or parched beans, ensuring that no fertile seed could take root beyond their shores. They understood that coffee was no mere commodity, it was a cultural talisman, a fragrant engine of trade and influence. But every fortress has a breach. In the early 1600s, the seeds of coffee's global conquest were sown by an unlikely smuggler, an Indian mystic named Baba Vaidyanath. During his pilgrimage to Mecca, he tasted the drink that had so beguiled the Sufis. When it was time to return home, he strapped 7 green coffee seeds to his chest, hidden beneath his robes like a precious secret. Back in the lush hills of southern India, he planted them carefully, perhaps not knowing that he had set in motion a transformation that would ripple across continents in centuries. From there, coffee's conquest was unstoppable. Dutch traders soon spirited the beans to the island of Java, and from those volcanic slopes, coffee fanned out to Europe, where it would seduce kings, philosophers, and common folk alike. But that is a tale for another night. For now, remember this. Every morning's cup of coffee carries within it the wild hills of Abyssinia, the midnight chants of Yemeni mystics, and the fierce debates of Ottoman poets. In every sip, there is a taste of centuries, a hint of how even the humblest of seeds can change the world. Those first smuggled seeds, sown in the rich soil of southern India, would give rise to vast coffee kingdoms empires that would, in time, stretch across oceans and centuries. Meanwhile, across the windswept harbors of Europe, something else was brewing: curiosity. European merchants, particularly the adventurous Venetians and the ever-crafty traders of the Dutch East India Company, caught wind of this mysterious black brew, beloved by the desert, mystics, and scholars of the East. They smelled opportunity and the heady promise of profit. Soon enough, coffee slipped into Europe's bustling ports, first in Venice, then in the lively markets of Marseille, the misty alleys of London, and the stoic canals of Amsterdam. At first, coffee was an exotic oddity, a rare and costly indulgence. Apothecaries sold it alongside tinctures and tonics, claiming it could cure everything from melancholy to gout. A miraculous bean indeed. But coffee was no passing novelty. It was a force zone that would soon be impossible to ignore. By the dawn of the 17th century, coffee houses began to bloom across Europe like mushrooms after a summer rain, mirroring their Ottoman cousins in spirit, if not in architecture. In London, these establishments quickly earned the nickname penny universities. Why? Because for the price of a single cup, one could wander into a world of heady debate and dazzling ideas, brushing shoulders with philosophers, poets, and merchants in equal measure. These coffee houses were not merely places to warm one's hands on a cold morning. They were vibrant engines of thought. The rich, the poor, the curious, and the cunning all gathered under the same smoky rafters, and the air was electric with possibility. But of course, not everyone was pleased. Much like the suspicious imams and mullahs of Istanbul's early coffee scene, European monarchs and church elders looked on with wary eyes. What seeds of dissent might be sown in these buzzing dens of caffeine-fueled conversation? In 1675, King Charles II of England made a bold attempt to snuff out this rising tide of chatter. He declared coffee houses breeding grounds for false news and treasonous talk, and ordered them closed. The outcry was immediate and fierce. Within weeks, the decree was quietly abandoned, a testament to coffee's stubborn hold on the hearts and minds of the people. Meanwhile, the Dutch were busy weaving coffee into the tapestry of empire. On the emerald shores of Java, they began cultivating the precious plant on a massive scale. From these colonial plantations, coffee spilled outward, no longer a local treasure of mystics and merchants, but a global commodity that would flow into every corner of the known world. By the 18th century, coffee was no longer just a drink. It was a revolution in a cup. In the bustling heart of London, more than 500 coffee houses jostled for patrons by the early 1700s. Each had its own particular flavor. Some were havens for poets, others for traders, scientists, or scheming politicians. In one, Isaac Newton and Edmund Halley argued the mysteries of the cosmos. Across town at Lloyd's Coffee House, marine insurers laid the foundation for modern insurance as they sipped their cups in smoky rooms. Across the street from Parliament itself, members of the realm's ruling council fortified themselves with coffee before plunging into heated debates. Unlike the raucous taverns where ale dulled the wits, coffee sharpened them. In this age of reason, coffee was its liquid fuel. In France, the coffee houses of Paris became salons of radical thought. As the fires of revolution crackled ever closer, places like Café Procope thrummed with pamphlet readings and impassioned speeches. Voltaire and Rousseau traded barbed insights over porcelain cups. Robespierre himself was said to have found inspiration there. In those dark brews, revolution found its spark proof that a single cup of coffee could be more powerful than 1,000 swords. Even across the churning Atlantic, in the distant colonies of the New World, coffee began to supplant tea as the drink of choice. After the Boston Tea Party in 1773, when tea became a symbol of imperial oppression, the simple act of drinking coffee became a quiet act of rebellion. In the flickering light of campfires, Continental Army soldiers brewed their coffee strong and bitter. George Washington himself was rumored to be an avid drinker, his mind as keen as the blade of his saber. But what was it about coffee that turned it from mere stimulant to cultural catalyst? Surely it wasn't just the jolt of caffeine, though that played no small part. No, it was the setting itself. A coffee house did not demand pedigree or wealth. One did not need a title to enter only curiosity and the price of a cup. In a world rigid with monarchy and class, the cafe was a breath of democratic air and idea, as revolutionary as any manifesto. By the close of the 18th century, coffee had become more than a mere drink. It was a symbolic vessel for the restless spirit of the age. Coffee houses gave voice to the voiceless, lent clarity to muddled thoughts, and offered a stage where the world's next chapter could be whispered into being. And yet, the journey of coffee was only halfway complete. From the muddy streets of London to the polished salons of Paris, the brew had already proven itself a force to be reckoned with. But beyond Europe's crowded cities, new landsand, new dreams awaited. The bean that once spurred a goatherd's goats to dance was about to conquer the world in earnest. The thirst for control over this bitter, beguiling beantha, once sacred fruit of wild hillside shad, become insatiable. What had begun as a cherished local ritual was swept up in the vast machinery of European colonial ambition, transformed into a global commodity that mirrored the empire's own hunger for power and profit. Like sugar, tea, and cotton, coffee was woven into the tapestry of empire, its dark tendrils reshaping entire landscapes and lives. By the late 1600s, the Dutch had already planted the seeds of this transformation, quite literally, in the fertile soils of Java. From there, coffee spread like wildfire across the colonial world. The French took it to the sun-baked Caribbean islands, finding fertile ground in Saint Dominique, today known as Haiti. The Portuguese ferried it to Brazil's endless green hills, while Spanish planters carried it to the warm valleys of Central America. Wherever the climate permitted, coffee followed, carried not by monks or mystics anymore, but by the relentless hand of imperial commerce. But this expansion came at a terrible cost. Behind each cup of rich, aromatic brew was a system of labor built on broken backs and shackled limbs. Enslaved workers and, later, indentured laborers were forced to coax the bitter beans from steep mountain slopes, often in brutal conditions. In the humid valleys of Brazil and the Caribbean, fortunes were made on the backs of the enslaved. Coffee was profit, and profit has never been known for mercy. Brazil in particular emerged as a giant of the coffee trade. By the mid-1800s, it was supplying over half the world's coffee and empire of beans that would endure well into the modern age. The sprawling plantations, known as fazendas, were symbols of both wealth and deep injustice. Sustained by slavery until its final abolition in 1888, the last stronghold of human bondage in the Americas. Meanwhile, the very land that had given birth to coffee Africa saw the return of the bean, but not as a homecoming. European colonizers, ever hungry for profit, introduced vast commercial plantations in Ethiopia, Kenya, and beyond, forever disrupting the careful rhythms of traditional life. Local farmers, who once grew coffee for kin and ceremony, were pushed into cash crop economies, forced to grow for distant markets rather than their own survival. Yet, even in the shadow of these injustices, coffee remained a vital thread in the cultural fabric of these regions. In Ethiopia, the ancient coffee ceremony, slow, reverent preparation of the brew endured as a symbol of hospitality and spiritual connection. In the lush hills of Latin America, coffee became a lifeline, both economic and communal, a reason to gather and share in the simple joys of a warm cup. By the close of the 19th century, coffee was no longer a local delicacy or a mark of mystic ritual. It had become a global empire in itself, a contradiction brewed in every pot. A drink that connected continents and cultures, yet also mirrored the deep divides and cruelties of the age. As the world stepped into the 20th century, coffee's journey was far from over. The age of industrial might and restless cities brought new demands. Urbanization and the steady rise of modern life transformed not only how coffee was consumed, but what it meant to the people who drank it. In factories and offices, train stations, and hurried street corners, coffee became the fuel of the modern worker. It no longer belonged solely to the aristocrats and poets of old. It was now the drink of everyone, everywhere. One of the most radical changes arrived in 1901 when Italian engineer Luigi Bezzera invented a machine that would forever alter coffee's destiny. His design forced pressurized water through finely ground coffee, turning the leisurely brewing process into a quick, potent ritual. In seconds, a small, dark cup emerged. The espresso. Strong, intense, a distillation of energy itself. With this invention, coffee culture itself shifted. Gone was the slow, thoughtful ceremony of the Ottoman coffee house. In the bustling cafes of Milan and Rome, patrons stood at marble counters, downed their shots of espresso, traded a few words, and moved on. This was coffee for the industrial age. Brisk, efficient, and unapologetically direct. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, coffee was taking root as the very heartbeat of American life. Mass production made it cheap and ubiquitous. In 1900, the Hills brothers introduced vacuum-sealed tins of coffee, giving it a longer shelf life and wider reach. During the World Wars, American soldiers carried instant coffee in their kits, gritty, bitter, and fiercely loved nonetheless. Amid the mud and the shell fire, it was a small comfort, a taste of routine in the chaos. By the middle of the century, the world hummed with the sound of percolators and the clink of diner mugs. The humble cup of coffee became a morning ritual that cut across class and creed. In greasy spoons, in gleaming break rooms, in battered thermoses at job sites, and in the hurried clatter of commuter trains, coffee was there. A lifeline of warmth and caffeine, woven into the rhythm of daily life. But as convenience took hold, something precious was lost. Instant coffee's bland predictability replaced the layered complexity of fresh roasted beans. What had once been a sensory journey, aromas of earth and fire, hints of fruit and smoke, became, for many, little more than a background buzz. A jolt of energy, but stripped of the experience. Yet even as coffee became an industrial necessity, the humble bean waited for a new generation to rediscover its ancient magic. Because coffee, after all, has always been more than a drink. It is a testament to how something as simple as a seed can reshape empires, fuel revolutions, and bring people together in the glow of shared warmth-owned cup at a time. The next chapter in coffee's epic tale was not written by industrial barons or colonial power sit, came from a quieter revolution, a shift driven by the growing desire to rediscover coffee's soul, one slow pour at a time. By the twilight of the 20th century, coffee was everywhere, an omnipresent companion in office break rooms, kitchen counters, and every gas station along the highway. It was a morning ritual, as commonplace as brushing one's teeth, a predictable comfort in a world that rarely slowed down. But beneath that hum of convenience, a quiet rebellion was bubbling, a movement that refused to see coffee as a mere commodity, instead treating it as a craft and art form, worthy of reverence. This was the birth of what became known as the third wave of coffee. The first wave had been about accessibility and mass production, bringing coffee to the masses. The second wave had given birth to the cafe culture franchises and bustling coffee houses where espresso was king and foam was frothed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. But the third wave looked backward and forward in the same breath, demanding to know, where did this bean come from? Who tended it? How was it roasted and brewed? What hidden symphony of flavors could be teased out with a gentler touch? This revolution sparked in places as far-flung as Portland and Oslo, Melbourne and Tokyo cities, where small-batch roasters and curious drinkers began treating coffee as something to be revered rather than consumed mindlessly. Light roasts took center stage, revealing delicate notes that had been scorched away by the dark roasts of old. Single-origin beans told stories of place and climate, each cup a miniature map of altitude and rain. Suddenly, coffee counters looked more like chemistry labs than cozy nooks. Glass siphons, precision scales, and ceramic drip cones appeared where once only battered steel urns stood. Curious patrons watched as baristas, longer mere servers, but artisans manipulated water temperature and grind size with the care of a jeweler setting a gemstone. In these small moments, a cup of coffee became an experience, a performance. It wasn't just about the taste, though that mattered. It was about ethics and sustainability. Roasters forged direct relationships with farmers, bypassing exploitative middlemen to ensure that the people who grew the beans shared in the fruits of their labor. Bags of beans became storybooks, each label crowded with details of origin and elevation, of washing and drying methods. No longer a faceless drink, coffee now had a name and a fashion identity that traveled from farm to cup. Of course, not everyone welcomed the change. Some found the new floral, acidic profiles baffling or too precious by half. Others bristled at the higher prices and the air of exclusivity. But beyond the snobbery and the hashtags, the core idea was clear and profound. Coffee was more than a morning fix-it, was a portal into history, culture, and craft, all swirling together in a single cup. As more people discovered this, the global conversation around coffee deepened. It wasn't just about how coffee was made. It was about how it made people feel. In every sip, there was a journey, a connection to distant hillsides and sun-drenched fields, a tribute to the hands that coaxed those stubborn green beans to life. Throughout history, coffee has always been more than a drink. It has been a spark for ideas, a companion to late-night creation, and a fuel for the restless soul. In the smoky salons of Enlightenment-era Paris, it was coffee that fueled the sharp philosophies of Voltaire and his fellow thinkers. In Vienna's grand cafes, it inspired composers like Beethoven, who was rumored to count out exactly 60 beans for each morning's brew, precision as ritual, flavor as symphony. In the crowded coffee houses of London, Charles Dickens and his Victorian peers found not only warmth, but a window into the roiling city, its street cries, and its secrets. These places weren't silent retreats. They were vibrant stages, alive with the stories of a world in constant motion. As centuries turned, coffee never lost its place at the heart of creative ferment. In the smoky jazz clubs of 20th century New York, the beat poets Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and their restless tribe scribbled verses over cups of bitter black coffee, each sip another stanza in their quest to capture the pulse of the city. In Seattle, long before Starbucks became a global empire, small coffee shops served as sanctuaries for grunge musicians and dreamers alike, places where the music was raw and the coffee was strong enough to keep the night alive. Coffee has never merely accompanied creativity. It has accelerated it. It lifts moods, sharpens thoughts, and lends a gentle euphoria that alcohol cannot match. Where whiskey blurs, coffee clarifies. Where beer makes tongues wag, coffee makes minds dance. In the end, coffee is more than a beverage. It is an invitation to stay awake, to stay curious, to reach across the table and connect with another soul. One sip, one conversation, one spark of inspiration at a time. Coffee's role in history has never been confined to mere cups, and sleepy morning sit has been a quiet conspirator in revolutions. From the salons of 18th century France, where revolutionaries sharpened their rhetoric over thick brews, to the flickering lamplit cafes of 20th century Africa and Latin America, coffee houses have often doubled as sanctuaries for the restless and the rebellious. In the mountains of Cuba, Fidel Castro and his companions sipped potent cafecito, the dark brew, a brief comfort before the next skirmish. In Algeria, resistance to French rule fermented in smoky cafes where words were as potent as bullets. Coffee, served hot and black, was often the last quiet ritual before the world outside was challenged anew. Today, cafes remain havens for the creative and the curious. Writers tap at battered keyboards, musicians fill notebooks with half-formed songs, and artists sketch strangers from quiet corners, all drawn to the gentle promise of time that slows and thoughts that stretch. In every generation, coffee asks the same question, what if? And in every generation, minds have answered. As we sip our lattes and pour our cold brews in this modern age, it's easy to forget the precarious future that coffee now faces. Climate change, economic imbalance, and relentless consumption threaten every part of the bean's journey. Like the hardy little plant it springs from, coffee continues to adapt, but the struggle is real. One of the gravest threats comes from the environment itself. Arabica coffee, which makes up the bulk of the world's cherished brew, is unusually fussy sensitive to temperature shifts and the altitude of its mountain home. Rising global temperatures and unpredictable rains have already begun to push these growing regions higher, narrower, more fragile. Diseases like coffee, leaf, rust, and pests such as the borer beetle thrive in these new climates, decimating crops from Central America to the Emerald Hills of East Africa. In the face of these changes, a new generation of scientists and farmers are working together to save the soul of coffee. They're developing hardier coffee strains, reviving shaded cultivation methods that preserve both yields and ecosystems, and weaving regenerative farming practices into the land itself. But it's a race against indifference and the ticking clock of a warming planet. Economic challenges remain just as daunting. The global thirst for coffee often masks the sobering truth that most of the people who grow it live on the edge of survival. Price swings in global markets mean that small-scale farmers are often paid less than it costs to bring their beans to harvest. In response, a movement for fairer trade has gathered strength: direct trade, transparent sourcing, and consumers who are finally starting to ask not just how their coffee tastes, but who grew it and under what conditions. Technology, too, is reshaping the story of coffee in ways both strange and wondrous. App-controlled home brewers, precision roasting guided by algorithms, and artificial intelligence that can sniff out subtle flavor, notations, and craft have never been closer. Yet even in this sea of innovation, the core of coffee remains the same: connection, comfort, and the quiet moment of pause in a crowded world. Culturally, the global exchange of ideas around coffee has never been richer. Japanese pour-over techniques shape the menus of Parisian cafes. Ethiopian coffee ceremonies, ancient and sacred, are being revived in bustling Western cities. Cold brew born in Brooklyn finds fans in Nairobi. The world grows smaller, but the kaleidoscope of flavors and stories keeps expanding. So, where does the journey of coffee go next? Perhaps the real future of coffee lies not just in new technologies or climate solutions, but in remembering what made it matter in the first place. In the dignity of the hands that pick the cherries, in the quiet rituals that anchor communities, and in the conversations that begin over a shared cup. In every era, coffee has never just been a drink, it has been a reminder of our capacity to adapt, to dream, and to connect. And then, history's wheel turns once more. As Europe emerged from the shadow of Rome's collapse, it splintered into a patchwork of rival kingdoms and feuding territories. The old order, calm, ordered, and imperial, had vanished, and in its place rose a world of uncertainty and shifting loyalties. To survive in this fractious new age, rulers turned to a different kind of champion: the mounted warrior. But the first knights were not the paragons of chivalry we imagine today. They were mercenaries, hard-eyed men in mail, loyal not to honor but to silver and survival. These early horsemen were born of necessity. The stirrup, a humble piece of technology imported from the East, gave warriors a newfound mastery of mounted combat. Lords rewarded these warriors with land a patch of soil for a lifetime of service, and thus the bones of the feudal system were set. In return for their loyalty in arms, these knights pledged their swords to the petty kings and restless barons who squabbled over every inch of Europe's battered fields. Armored cavalry became the iron backbone of medieval warfare, their thundering charge reshaping battlefields and turning the tide of countless skirmishes. Their status grew with each victory. With each land grant and each conquered hilltop, the knights became more than mercenaries. They were the fist of the realm, the shield of the castle, gate fearsome, proud, and endlessly adaptable. Yet, even as they rose to power, the seeds of a new ideal began to take root, a notion that honor might be as potent as steel, and that the loyalty of a knight could be measured not just in coin, but in the quiet promise of duty. With great power always comes Paraland, so it was for the knights of early medieval Europe. Many of these armored warriors, once the iron fist of the feudal lords, transformed into little more than marauding warlords. They pillaged villages, extorted gold, and terrorized the countryside under the thin veneer of loyalty. Their unchecked violence troubled kings and clergy alike. If knights were to wield such power, they would need to be restrained not only by law, but by a code of conduct, a moral code that reached beyond the clang of steel. Thus began the slow, stubborn birth of chivalry. Not the poetic pageantry of later ballads or the romantic visions of courtly love, but a hard-nosed solution to an urgent crisis. The church, seeking to tame these ironclad brutes, began to spin a new narrative. Knights were not just enforcers, they were guardians. They were to defend the faith, shield the helpless, and fight with something more than just their swords. The Crusades played a critical role in this transformation. When Christian armies marched east to reclaim the Holy Land at the close of the 11th century, knights were recast as sacred warriors, bearing crosses on their tunics and blessed by the church before battle. Their missions were framed not as plunder, but as divine duty. The knight was reborn in the fires of holy war, not merely a soldier, but a symbol of spiritual might. No longer was the knight a hired killer on horseback. In the evolving ethos of Europe, he became an emblem of higher ideal strength fused with restraint, vengeance balanced by mercy, power yoked to virtue. The blade was still sharp, but now it was meant to serve something nobler. The code of chivalry was never written down as a single, binding document. It evolved organically, an unwritten pact shaped by the customs of warriors, the moral teachings of the church, and the refined manners of courtly life. But its message was unmistakable. A knight was to be more than a killer in iron. He was to be a model of discipline and virtue, a protector in an age of wolves. At its core, chivalry demanded unflinching loyalty first to one's lord, then to one's comrades, and finally to one's own word. An oath taken by a knight was a bond as sacred as any chapel vow. To break, it was to shatter the very core of his being. Honor, too, was paramount. Not the boastful honor of self-congratulation, but a quiet, unwavering commitment to do what was right, even when the world was not watching. Knights were expected to be brave, yes, but not reckless. Valor had to be guided by wisdom, and violence was to be wielded only when the cause was just, and only when every other path had been closed. Humility was as much a part of knighthood as a polished breastplate. A true knight understood his place before God. He did not crow about his victories or trample the weak in his climb to power. He was to lift others up, not crush them under his mailed boot. The protection of the vulnerable, the poor, the elderly, women and children was not charity. It was obligation. The sword was not to dominate, but to shield. Courtesy extended even to one's enemies. A defeated knight deserved mercy, not mockery. A captured foe was to be spared if he yielded. In an age when mercy was rare and might was right, this restraint was nothing short of revolutionary. At the heart of chivalry was also piety. The knight's faith was to be more than Sunday ritual, it was to be lived out on the field and in the quiet of dawn prayers. The knight was expected to serve not just his earthly lord, but also the divine, and to carry that weight with both grace and gravity. Yet, for all its nobility, chivalry was often more an ideal than a practice. The history books are littered with tales of knights who fell far short of their oath pillaging the innocent, waging private wars, and chasing power with reckless abandon. But even in failure, the code endured as a moral compass, a set of questions every knight had to face, not just how skilled his hand with the sword, but what cause he would fight for. Knighthood was not simply bestowed with a tap of a blade on a waiting shoulder. It was the culmination of a lifetime's preparation known that shaped not only the warrior's body, but also his soul. This journey began not on the battlefield, but in the hushed halls of a noble household. From the tender age of 7, a boy of noble birth would be sent away from the warmth of his family to begin his path as a page. It was the first step in a long climb toward the honor of knighthood. As a page, he was taught discipline before he ever touched a sword. He learned the rules of courtesy, how to serve at table, how to speak with respect, how to read the Latin prayers that filled the air of candlelit chapels. But it wasn't all stiff manners and hushed lessons. Pages trained their bodies as well as their minds riding horses with sure-footed grace, practicing the early forms of combat that would one day decide life and death. Above all, they learned obedience. For a knight to lead in war, he first had to learn to follow. A page learned the delicate balance of humility and pride, how to speak boldly but act with care, how to listen before he commanded. It was a crucible that would forge not just a warrior, but a man who understood that true power was never taken lightly. Before a young man could command others, he had to learn to obey, to listen before he led, to serve before he struck. In his early teens, the page became a squire, stepping into a role of rigorous training and deeper purpose. Under the watchful gaze of an older knight, the squire learned not only the ways of war, but also the weight of honor. His days were a dance of discipline. He practiced the clash of swords, the measured grace of the joust, the deadly precision of archery. He cared for armor with reverence, knowing that each dented plate was a testament to battle's fury. He groomed the great war horses, creatures as proud and fierce as any knight. And when battle came, the squire rode alongside his master not to fight, but to serve. He mended armor, dressed wounds, and carried the lessons of the code in the thunder of hooves and the cries of the fallen. Yet the education of a squire was not all forged in steel. In the calm of the court, he learned music and poetry, the art of diplomacy, and the delicate dance of words. He wrote letters in flowing Latin script and learned to speak with the measured courtesy expected of noble blood. Central to this courtly life was the ideal of courtly love, a chivalric devotion to a noble lady, more a symbol of honor than a matter of the heart and aspiration toward grace and selflessness, no matter how distant or unattainable. These lessons shaped the squire into something more than a fighter. They forged a man who understood that to wield power was to wield responsibility, a lesson that the fires of war alone could never teach. When a squire proved himself through loyalty in battle, through the quiet strength of service, or through years of unyielding dedication, he was deemed ready to be called a knight. The transformation was not merely a title, but a profound passage. The ceremony was solemn and layered with symbolism, a bridge from the untested to the eternal. The night before, the squire would cleanse himself in a ritual bathwater, washing away not just the dust of travel, but the sins of boyhood. He dressed in garments rich with meaning, a white tunic for purity, a red robe for courage, and a black cloak for the humility that every true knight must carry in his heart. In a small chapel, candlelight flickering in the cold dark, he knelt in vigil. Alone, or with his brothers in arms, he prayed through the night this sword laid before the altar, a silent promise to wield it in service of something greater. As dawn's first light touched the chapel walls, the formal ceremony began. A priest would bless the squire's sword, praying that it would be a blade for justice, not cruelty. Then, a noble or perhaps a king, a father, a brother, or a distant cousin performed the accolade. With a light tap of the blade on each shoulder, the squire was no longer a boy in service. He was a knight. Yet it was not the steel that made him soit, was the words spoken in that hushed hall. He swore to protect the innocent, to be loyal to his lord and steadfast in faith, to speak truth even when it cut deeper than a sword's edge. The exact words varied from kingdom to kingdom, century to century, but their spirit never wavered. The knight's strength belonged not to himself, but to something greater. The new knight often received gifts that carried both honor and duty, a gleaming sword to wield, a swift horse to ride, golden spurs to mark his station, or a ring to seal his promises. Feasts followed tables heavy with roasted meats and sweetmeats, goblets raised to toast the newest brother in arms. Yet beneath the laughter and music lay a sober truth. To break his oath was to break himself, to risk not only disgrace, but his very soul. Knighthood was never granted by birth alone. It was earned with sweat and silence, with blood and belief. And once earned, it became a second skin and armor that clung not just to his shoulders, but to his very spirit, visible or invisible, until the end of his days. To be a knight was to live by the sword, but also to know when to hold it still. On battlefields where chaos reigned and blood was a cheap currency, the code of chivalry asked for something rare: self-control. Knights were trained to kill with deadly precision, but the code demanded they temper brutality with justice, vengeance with mercy. In the brutal campaigns of medieval Europe crusades, border wars, feudal skirmishes, this was no small feat. Yet even amid the slaughter, chivalry's power lingered. A defeated noble who yielded his sword could expect to be spared captured rather than killed, ransomed instead of left to rot. This was not merely compassion, it was custom. The life of a nobleman held value, and even the clash of steel was bound by this respect. The code of chivalry went further still. Knights were expected to avoid wanton destruction, to protect those who had no part in the fight: peasants, clergy, women, and children. War was a contest of equals, not an excuse to unleash cruelty on the helpless. Of course, reality often fell short. Villages were burned, oaths broken, and innocents suffered. But even then, such violations stained a knight's reputation like blood on a white tunic. The dishonor lingered long after the battlefield was silent. Chivalry's grip reached beyond the clash of swords. A knight was expected to announce himself, to bear his coat of arms proudly, and to never strike an enemy from behind. Surprise and deception were the tools of lesser men. A true knight fought face to face, giving his enemy the dignity of knowing death was near. In tournaments, jousts and melees played out in the list nights demonstrated these ideals without the finality of mortal combat. They tested their skill and courage in controlled spectacles, turning the art of war into pageantry. There, prowess was celebrated not for its lethality, but for its elegance and restraint. And when a knight won, he was to be gracious in victory, offering a hand to a vanquished opponent, binding his wounds if need be. In these moments, the true weight of chivalry revealed itself, not in blood spilled, but in the mercy shown afterward. For the knight, battle was not a sport of bloodlust, but a duty bound to a higher calling. How he fought said as much about his soul as it did about his skill. Yet the identity of a knight was not forged solely in the forge of war. Away from the fields of battle, the knight was shaped by other arts, music, poetry, and the subtle dance of devotion known as courtly love. In the medieval imagination, a true knight was as much a poet as a warrior, as capable of gentle grace as of savage might. Courtly love was no idle pastime. Emerging in the courts of southern France in the 12th century, it was a cultural movement shaped by troubadours and the refined etiquette of the nobility. In this tradition, a knight's devotion to a lady often married, always socially beyond his reach, was an act of reverence rather than conquest. He would dedicate himself to her with fierce loyalty, not through possession, but through the quiet nobility of service. This love was rarely consummated. It was an ideal, a spiritual flame that demanded patience, humility, and the poetry of longing. The lady was the muse, the knight, her humble vassal. He wore her favor a ribbon or a token into battle, drew strength from her name, whispered on the edge of sleep. Songs were composed, quests undertaken, all in her honor. In this way, even the knight's blade was guided not only by honor, but by the secret ache of devotion. But courtly love was more than romantic fancy. It was a refining fire for the knight's character, a gentle discipline to balance the violence of his trade. It taught that true strength lay not only in the arm, but in the heart. Noble women, though often barred from the battle lines and the councils of war, wielded real influence within this world. They could grant or deny their favor, shaping reputations and testing a knight's worth. With a word or a glance, they could elevate a man to legend or demand he rise higher than his baser instincts. Of course, as with all ideals, reality was messier. Not every knight was noble in heart, and not every courtly affair was pure of intent. But the tales endured of Lancelot and Guinevere, of Tristan and Isolde, stories of love and duty colliding, often to tragic ends. In these legends, the lady became more than a prize. She became the soul of the knight, the party fought for, the party could never fully claim. While chivalry prized honor, restraint, and devotion, it also placed loyalty at its very core, not just to a single lord or lady, but to one's brothers in arms. In a world of shifting alliances and feudal rivalries, the bond between knights was more than simple camaraderie. It was a matter of survival. It was trust, not just in steel, but in spirit. Knights did not live as solitary champions. They rode together, trained together, and camped side by side beneath star-pricked skies. They shared firelight and war stories, laughter, and quiet fears. These were men who bled together, who watched each other's backs when the arrows fell like rain. In the lonely hours before dawn, they forged a brotherhood that no title or estate could ever match. Side by side, knights rode into battle, their shields gleaming beneath the sun and their hearts bound by shared oaths. Each man knew that the one to his left might be the only shield between him and the cold embrace of death. Loyalty to one's liege lord lay at the heart of the chivalric ideala. Knight's oath bound him not just to serve, but to sacrifice. In return, the lord was duty-bound to provide protection, land, and the honor that kept a man's name alive in song and story. This bond, sealed by solemn vows and often blessed by the church's hand, was more than mere contract. It was sacred. To break it was not just treachery, it was a betrayal of the soul. Yet as important as the knight's loyalty to his lord was the unspoken loyalty he shared with his fellow warriors. On the battlefield and in the tilt yard, friendships forged in the din of combat became lifelong alliances. A knight was expected to defend the names of his comrades, to stand by them in the clamor of battle and, if fate demanded, to avenge their deaths. A knight's reputation was never built alone, it was burnished by the respect of his peers. For those who took the code even further, there were the great orders of knighthood like the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers. These were not just brotherhoods of war, but communities bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their loyalty was to each other and to God above all else. In these orders, chivalry was not merely practiced, it was lived, enforced, and honed into a way of life. This respect for the code extended even to enemies. It was not uncommon for knights on opposing sides to admire each other's courage, to offer mercy to a captured foe. A worthy enemy was still a brother of the sword, divided by banners but united by a shared understanding of the code. In the end, a knight's honor was measured not only by how he served his lord or adored his lady, but by how he stood with his brothers when the arrows flew, when the standards fell, and only loyalty remained. As the medieval world stumbled into the 14th and 15th centuries, the code of chivalry faced the grim test of a world reshaping itself. The battlefield was changing, and the old ways of war were crumbling under the weight of new realities. The first great disruptor was gunpowder. Cannons and muskets emerged like thunder in the night, and their brute force made a mockery of the old knightly armor. A single musket ball could do what even the finest sword could not: pierce the steel breastplate, shatter the charge, and send even the most gallant knight to the earth. The familiar rhythms of mounted combat gave way to volleys fired from distant hills, to sieges that ground cities to rubble. In this new world, honor often meant little when death came from a faceless shot in the smoke. Meanwhile, the rise of standing armies and professional soldiers eroded the knight's place in the line of battle. Kings no longer needed to rely solely on the feudal levies or the retinues of noble houses. They hired soldiers of fortune and mercenaries who fought for coin, not for fealty. The knight, once the living embodiment of martial virtue, began to look like a relic and echo of an age that was fast fading. Politically, the knightly class also found itself under siege. Centralized monarchies were gathering power, sweeping away the patchwork of feudal fiefdoms. The independence of lords and knights was devoured by the hungry jaws of royal authority. The old codes of personal loyalty clashed with the needs of a modern state that prized order and obedience above ancient bonds. Even the moral strength of chivalry began to crack under the strain. Greed and ambition often spoke louder than oaths. Knights who had sworn to protect the weak sometimes turned their swords on the helpless, sacking cities and pillaging villages under the same banners that claimed to stand for mercy. The ideals of justice and restraint were too often traded for plunder and glory. Yet chivalry did not vanish entirely. It changed its shape, slipping from the world of mud and blood into the world of myth. In the ballads sung in smoky taverns and the romances written in candlelit chambers, the image of the noble knight lived on. Writers like Sir Thomas Malory and Chrétien de Troyes captured the fading light of this code in their tales of Arthurian valor and courtly devotion. They turned the knight from a man of steel into a symbol and emblem of what was possible when strength was guided by virtue. Even as the knights themselves faded into the mist of history, the ideals they had carried like banners into battle did not vanish. On the battlefield, the code of chivalry eventually gave way to the cold calculus of gunpowder and cannon fire. But in the heart, it survived. No longer a law of war, it became a quiet longing for honor over power, for purpose over pride, for something higher than mere steel. Though the age of armored warriors has long since passed, the chivalric spirit endures. Its essence, honor, courage, loyalty, restraint still whispers in the choices we make, in the stories we tell, and in the silent ways we try to live with dignity. What began as a code for mounted warriors echoes across centuries, shaping our ideas of virtue and justice far beyond the clash of blades. You can hear it in the tales that still stir our imaginations, where the archetype of the noble knight remains alive. From the legends of King Arthur to the fierce resolve of Don Quixote, even to the modern superheroes who walk city streets in capes and cowls, the same figure persists. The solitary soul who stands for what is right, even when the world around him is broken. We still speak of doing the honorable thing, still praise knightly behavior in those who defend the weak or act with integrity when it would be easier to turn away. Chivalry's influence is woven into the traditions of armies and the solemn rituals of service. In boardrooms, sports fields, and halls of governance, we find echoes of the knight's challenge to hold power, but never let it devour conscience. Chivalry has evolved, shedding the armor and the rigid codes of fealty to become something broader, something open to anyone, anywhere. It no longer belongs to an elite caste of men in steel, but to anyone who chooses to stand firm in the face of cruelty, to be brave without violence, to choose mercy over revenge, to speak truth when silence would be easier. These acts are the true inheritance of chivalry. And in a world still scarred by greed, violence, and indifference, its quiet message is as urgent as ever. That strength should answer to the voice of conscience. That power exists to serve, not to rule, and that dignity is not found in wealth or bloodlines, but in how we treat those most in need of protection. So while no knights ride beneath fluttering banners today, their code endures not as a suit of iron, but as armor for the soul. And in those quiet moments when we choose honor over gain, when we lift a hand to help instead of harm, we carry the sword still. From the poetry of ideals to the crackle of ancient fires, the story turns now to another material born of both violence and beauty: glass. Glass, for all its brilliance and clarity, began in chaos. Long before humans learned to shape it, nature was already forging glass in the fury of storms and the violence of volcanoes. When lightning slammed into desert sands or molten lava roared down slopes, the searing heat fused grains of silica into glossy shards of obsidian, jet black and sharp as a whispered oath. Early humans saw in this natural glass a gift from the gods, using it to tip their arrows, to cut, to shape, to make the invisible world tangible. But the real chapter in the story of glass began not in the random violence of nature, but in the controlled curiosity of humankind. Sometime around 2000 BCE, in the sun-baked lands of Mesopotamia or along the banks of the Nile, people discovered that sand mixed with minerals and exposed to intense heat did not merely harden or crack, it melted. And when it cooled, it transformed into something new, a glossy, colorful material that seemed to capture light itself. The earliest human-made glass was not clear or smooth as a mirror. It was thick and vibrant, opaque blues and cloudy greens, earthy whites that seemed to glow from within. It was not for windows or lenses. Such ideas would come centuries later. Instead, it was shaped into beads, amulets, and tiny vessels, treasures to adorn the living or accompany the dead. Glass was more akin to gemstone than tool, rare and mystical, as much an object of reverence as of trade. How did these first artisans discover its secrets? Some believe it happened by accident. Perhaps a potter's kiln grew too hot, or a metalworker experimenting with new glazes stumbled on the formula for fusion. Others suggest it might have happened on some windswept beach, where the intense heat of a driftwood fire melted the sand it burned upon. However it began, the revelation was profound. Unlike stone or metal, glass could take any shape the craftsman dared to imagine. It could shimmer like water, hold light within its depths, and if handled with care, remain unchanged for centuries. The discovery of glass marked a shift in how humans understood the world of materials. It was solid, yet seemed to capture the intangible. Fragile, yet born of the toughest elements of the earth. In that first molten glow, the promise of transformation flickered, promise that would echo down through time in every window pane, every delicate goblet, and every shard of stained glass that caught the sun's fire and turned it into something almost holy. It was in these ancient workshops, under the relentless sun of Egypt, and in the river-slick cities of Mesopotamia that the craft of glass truly came alive. What began as a chance byproduct of fire and chance was refined into an art form that shimmered with promise. Here, glass was no longer a mysterious accident. It was a deliberate act of creation, each piece a testament to human ingenuity. The earliest artisans did not work with the clear, flowing glass we know today. Instead, they practiced a technique called core forming. A soft clay core, sculpted into the shape of a bottle or flask, was carefully dipped or rolled in thick, viscous glass. While the glass was still warm and malleable, threads of color-rich blues, vivid greens, deep reds were laid atop it, combed and twisted into delicate patterns that danced across the surface. When the vessel cooled, the clay core was scraped out, leaving behind a hollow container that was as much a jewel as it was a jar. Every vessel was unique, painstakingly crafted by hand. In an age when status was measured by the rare and the beautiful, these glass objects were treasures. Color was everything. Mineral additives became the artisan's palette. Cobalt for the deepest blues. Copper for vibrant greens and earthy reds. Manganese for regal purples. In the flickering light of ancient hearths, these objects glowed like polished gems rivaling lapis, lazuli, and turquoise in their splendor. Egyptian tombs have yielded countless Peace Destiny perfume bottles, amulets, and mosaic inlays that once adorned the thrones of pharaohs. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets inscribed in the neat rows of cuneiform recorded some of the world's first glass-making recipestrid secrets, guarded like sacred relics. These were not merely instructions. They were keys to a kind of alchemy. The Phoenicians, masters of trade and travel, carried these shimmering artifacts across the Mediterranean. Their ships, laden with beads and vessels, brought glass from the Levant to the marketplaces of Greece, Crete, and beyond. Glass was rare and precious, a luxury for priests and kingshits, delicate forms fragile in transit, yet worth their weight in silver. But even as these early centuries unfolded, a transformation was underway. Glass was evolving from mere ornament to a medium of expression and art that hinted at something even greater. And soon, it would become something more, a lens that would change how we saw the world. Around the 1st century BCE, in the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, modern-day Syria and Lebanon, new technique took shape that would forever alter the destiny of glass blowing. Before this breakthrough, glass was shaped by painstaking labor, poured into molds or wrapped around clay cores. Each piece was an exercise in patience and precision. Glass blowing changed everything. A craftsman could dip a hollow metal pipe into a pot of molten glass, draw out a glowing blob, and with a single breath, inflate it like a balloon. By turning and shaping the soft, radiant form as it cooled, he could craft bowls, jars, and cups in minutes pieces that would have taken hours or days before. This was one of the most profound technological shifts in human history. Glass was no longer just for the gods and kings. Glass blowing made production faster and more versatile, opening the door to everyday use. The Roman Empire, teeming with trade, bustling with city life, connected by roads and was the perfect place for this new art to flourish. Workshops sprang up from Alexandria to the hill towns of Gaul. Roman glassblowers turned out cups for wine, flasks for perfumes, jars for precious oils, everyday objects that carried a hint of luxury to the growing middle class. Clear glass was still a distant dream, but the Romans found beauty in imperfection. The small bubbles and gentle ripples of molten glass became part of the design, transforming flaws into features. Green and amber tones glowed softly in the lamplight of Roman homes, and across the empire, glass became a part of daily life. The Romans, ever inventive, pushed the craft further still. Some experimented with mold-blown glass, pressing patterns and inscriptions directly into the molten walls of vessels. Others refined cutting and engraving, turning simple cups into miniature masterpieces, cameos, and decorated vessels that rivaled the finest ceramics. Yet, perhaps the most remarkable change was this. For the first time, glass could be thin and hollow qualities that would eventually make it transparent. This was more than an artistic revolution. It was cultural. It was a window into new ways of seeing the world. Glass had moved from the treasuries of kings to the kitchens and markets of Rome. It stored oil and perfume, it served wine at grand banquets, and it transformed light itself into something to be savored. In every swirl and flicker of color, glass carried a legacy that had begun in the fires of ancient curiosity and would one day shape how we see everything through windows, through lenses, through the glimmering edge of possibility. From the soft exhalation of breath into molten fire, a new world had been born. No longer was glass the exclusive treasure of priests and kings. Now it passed from hand to hand, through humble homes and bustling marketplaces. The age of glass had truly arrived, and with each passing generation, it was only getting clearer. With the mastery of glassblowing and the might of the Roman Empire to carry it forth, glass was no longer just a symbol of beauty or wealth, it was reshaping the way people physically saw the world. The next leap forward wasn't in the richness of color, but in the purity of clarity itself. Roman glassmakers discovered that by adding manganese dioxide to their molten mixtures, they could strip away the greenish tint caused by iron in the sand. The result was a pale, almost transparent glass, something that had never existed before. For the first time in human history, people could look through glass, not just at it. And with that quiet revolution, an entirely new concept was born: the window. In the luxurious bathhouses and stately villas of Rome, flat panes of glass were cast and set into stone frames. These early windows were imperfect, cloudy, wavy, and bubbled, but they let light pour inside while still holding back the wind and rain. Gone were the days when buildings had to rely solely on open air and wooden shutters. Now, light itself could be invited in, filtered through sheets of fire-born stone. True transparency was still a distant dream, but even these uneven panes changed everything. They turned light into something both mysterious and secreta, symbol of possibility that reached far beyond mere shelter. Centuries later, in the medieval world of soaring cathedrals, this idea would explode into a radiant expression of faith and artistry. In the cool hush of stone naves, stained glass windows rose like flowers of light, crafted from glass colored with metallic oxides and pieced together in lead tracery. These luminous tapestries told the stories of saints and martyrs, of kings and angels. Light, captured and bent by glass, became a sacred presence, washing altars in shifting reds and blues, casting a holy glow over the prayers of the faithful. These windows were more than decoration. They were sermons in glass, teaching the illiterate, inspiring the humble, and reminding all who knelt beneath them that light itself could be a window to the divine. In those Gothic cathedrals, where stone reached upward like a prayer and colored glass turned every dawn into a revelation, glass transcended its humble beginnings to become something eternal. Even as beauty and faith met in these windows, the science of glass was still advancing. Craftsmen learned to flatten sheets more evenly, to polish and grind until the glass was clearer and more uniform. With each improvement, glass grew closer to fulfilling its most profound destiny, to become not just a barrier or a canvas, but a tool for seeing the world as it truly was. The idea took hold. Glass could do more than catch the sun or adorn a chalice. It could bend light itself. This invisible power gave birth to one of humanity's most important tools, the lens. By the late medieval period, in the workshops of Italy, artisans began to experiment with curved glass. They found that by shaping glass into convex forms, it could magnify letters, sharpen blurred lines, and reveal detail lost to aging eyes. The first readings stone smooth, thick discs of glass were laid over the parchment pages of prayer books and chronicles, bringing words back into focus. In these small miracles of light, knowledge was saved from the shadows of failing vision. What was once lost to the passing years was preserved, carried forward by the quiet, patient work of glass. From these early lenses came spectacles eyeglasses that turned aging scholars into wise elders, that allowed generations of monks to keep copying the ancient texts by candlelight. In quiet scriptoria, glass became the savior of wisdom, a silent partner in the preservation of thought. But this was only the beginning. In the hands of those who dared to look further, lenses became not just tools for reading, but portals of discovery. By the 16th century, Italian artisans began to stack these lenses into tubes, crafting the first rudimentary telescopes. With them, Galileo Galilei turned his gaze to the heavens. Through a simple tube of glass and brass, he saw mountains on the moon and moons, circling Jupiter truths that toppled centuries of dogma and expanded the boundaries of human understanding. At the same time, Dutch craftsmen like Antony van Leeuwenhoek peered not at the stars, but into the secret world beneath the skin of reality itself. His hand-ground lenses screwed but powerful revealed teeming worlds in a single drop of water, the secret scaffolding of the human body, the tiny dramas of life, too small for the naked eye. Through the cold, clear curve of glass, he saw the invisible come-alive fibers, cells, and shimmering threads of blood, all laid bare beneath the microscope. In these moments, glass was no longer just an art. It became an extension of the human eye, a tool for peering into the unfathomable. From the telescope's endless sky to the microscope's hidden realms, glass bent lighten, with it, human knowledge into new shapes. In every lens, every clear pane, every quiet gleam of blown glass, there was the promise that sight was not the limit. It was the beginning. With each delicate grind and graceful curve, glass didn't merely shape the world around, it began to reshape the mind itself. The impact was seismic. Science itself was reborn in the silent light of glass. Biology, astronomy, and physics disciplines that once peered at the cosmos and the Earth, with guesswork found new clarity. Vague theories gave way to visual proof, and questions became evidence. For millennia, humanity had stared at the stars and wondered. Now, through glass, we could begin to understand. As the Renaissance dawned, another quiet miracle emerged from the furnace, the mirror. It was a revelation not of the heavens, but of the self. Before mirrors, reflections belonged to water, to polished bronze and silver. They gave only wavering, shadowy impressions. But in the workshops of Veniceware, craftsmen guarded their secrets as jealously as alchemists. The first modern mirrors took shape. Around the 14th century, Venetian glassmakers learned to create flawless flat panes, coating the reverse side with a thin layer of tin mercury amalgam. The result was a gleaming, almost perfect reflection. These mirrors were treasures, luxuries only the wealthy could afford, and the Venetians protected their secrets with an iron grip. Yet, when a person stood before one of these new mirrors, they saw more than a polished face. they saw themselves. The mirror became a tool for self-awareness, a portal for introspection, and a quiet revolution in how people saw not just the world, but themselves. Philosophers and poets were captivated. The mirror symbolized not only vanity, but truth illusion and revelation in the same pane of glass. Painters used mirrors to master light and perspective, ushering in a new age of realism and the soul-searching portraits of the Renaissance. In literature, mirrors became symbols of desire and doubt, of the mysteries that lay within us. And in the everyday lives of men and women, mirrors shaped habits and fashion, teaching people how to see themselves as individuals distinct, aware, alive. In folklore, the mirror was a gateway to the uncanny. Some whispered that it could trap souls or reveal truths hidden from mortal sight. Superstitions clung to its surface. A broken mirror meant 7 years of misfortune. A veiled one protected the souls of the dead. But even these fears could not stop the spread of this silent revolution. By the 17th century, the secrets of Venetian glass had spilled out across Europe. France and Germany began producing their own mirrors, once rare and guarded, now more common and accessible. For the first time, humanity wasn't just seeing the world through glass, it was seeing itself. In that quiet moment of reflection, something profoundly human stirred. The fragile awareness of identity and the shimmering echo of the soul. As the Enlightenment swept across Europe, bringing with it new revolutions of science, reason, and art, glass found yet another calling. No longer content to serve as delicate vessels or fleeting adornments, glass became a cornerstone of architecture, a medium that changed not just how buildings looked, but how they breathed and lived. For centuries, the great fortresses and townhouses of Europe were walled in stone, their interiors lit only by flickering candles and narrow slits of air. Windows were small, glass, a rare luxury that spoke more of wealth than of light. But with the growing skill of glassmakers, who learned to flatten, polish, and join larger panes, architects began to dream differently. Glass offered transparency, literally and symbolically. It invited the outside in, flooding dark chambers with the light of day and opening cramped spaces to the gentle rhythm of the world beyond. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the wealthiest homes in Europe began to boast broad, gleaming window portals of light that turned drawing rooms into sunlit stages. Grand estates sprouted glassy orangeries, botanical wonderlands that allowed tropical plants to flourish even in the chill of northern winters. These greenhouses were not just gardens, they were living experiments in the marriage of nature and architecture structures that glimmered like visions, half built of earth and half of sky. Then, in the 19th century, the power of glass met the audacity of industry. The Industrial Revolution gave rise to new methods of mass-producing flat glass and to iron frames that could hold it high. Architects no longer dreamed in stone alone, they dreamed in light. The most spectacular example of this new vision was the Crystal Palace, built in London in 1851 for the Great Exhibition. Rising like a dream in steel and glass, it was a cathedral, not of faith, but of progress. A vast, sunlit hall where entire trees could stand beneath its vaulting arches, where glass walls captured the shifting sky and turned even the clouds into part of its design. It was a marvel of engineering and a declaration of a new era, a world where glass was no longer a luxury, but a living part of daily life, transparent, open, and endlessly adaptable. Visitors strolled beneath arching glass ceilings, marveling at the way light and space danced together in shimmering harmony. It was as if the future had taken shape in those transparent vaults, limitless, luminous, and alive. From that moment on, glass became the unmistakable emblem of progress. Railway stations, grand shopping arcades, and exhibition halls all embraced this new language of light. No longer just a luxury or a scientific curiosity, glass became an architectural voice speaking of innovation, of clarity, and of a world ever more interconnected. It did more than simply let in the sun. It transformed how we engaged with space itself. Glass allowed us to see without being seen, to create thresholds instead of walls. Inside and outside were no longer separate. They were partners in a conversation. Privacy and exposure wove together in a delicate balance, framed by panes of gleaming transparency. In this way, the humble sheet of glass once, a treasure for kings, became a wall you could look through, a ceiling that caught the sky, a skin that let buildings breathe. And then, in the 20th century, glass took another leap home that transcended beauty and architecture. With the rise of electricity, the birth of computation, and the dawn of global communication, Glass evolved from a window to a conduit for knowledge itself. It became the silent engine behind the devices that would define the modern world. It began with a quiet marvel, the vacuum tube. These glass-encased cylinders, developed in the early 1900s, became the beating hearts of the first radios, televisions, and primitive computers. Without glass to create the sealed, sterile chambers, these delicate components would have been useless, too fragile to control the dance of electrons, to amplify sound, to carry the earliest pulses of data. Then came the cathode ray tube, the thick, heavy glass core of early televisions and computer screens. It was hardly elegant, but it was revolutionary. For the first time, images flickered to life on a glowing sheet of glass. Families gathered around these luminous rectangles, watching worlds unfold beyond their own. Live events, distant places, and visions of the future, all captured in the glassy eye of a new kind of hearth. As technology raced forward, glass kept pace. In fiber optics, impossibly thin threads of ultra-pure glass became highways for light-speed data. A single strand, finer than a human hair, could carry voices, music, and entire libraries of information across oceans and continents. What was once a fragile surface had become the backbone of the information age. And then, in the 20th century, glass became intimateur, daily companion, chemically strengthened and impossibly thin. It turned into the windows we carry in our pockets, the screens of our smartphone. Touch-sensitive and precise, it responds to the smallest tap, the faintest swipe, listening and guiding us through the digital wilderness. We no longer simply look through glass. We live in conversation with it, our fingers tracing luminous trails across its polished face. Glass is everywhere now. In satellite lenses peering down from orbit, in fiber optic cables hidden beneath the seas, in solar panels capturing the sun's breath on rooftops. It is no longer rare. It has become the quiet, crystalline backbone of our interconnected lives. A material that once adorned altars and thrones now carries the weight of the world's knowledge and dream. Yet, even as glass has become ubiquitous, it remains on the frontier of discovery. Today's scientists and engineers see it not as a passive medium, but as an active, intelligent surface. Smart glassable, to shift from transparent to opaque with a flick of a switches, already at work in modern buildings, airplanes, and vehicles, managing light and privacy with effortless elegance. In our modern world, glass has become more than just a static frame. It's now an active participant in how we live and see. Car windows that adapt to the sun's glare, walls that turn into shimmering canvases of light and data, entire building facades that glow softly with information. Responsive glass, alive with sensors, reading the world and adjusting itself in real time, has blurred the line between architecture and intelligence. In the growing push for sustainability, glass has stepped up as a silent harvester of energy. Transparent solar panel panes of glass embedded with photovoltaic cell scan now generate electricity while letting in the soft light of day. Imagine a world where the very skin of skyscrapers hums with quiet power, turning sunlight into energy, floor by floor. A quiet revolution, one window at a time. In the realm of medicine, glass has become a healer. Bioglassa, specialized form of this ancient material, helps regenerate bone, coaxing new life into damaged limbs. In the vast silence of space, glass ceramics shield our spacecraft from searing radiation and freezing dark. And in the emerging frontier of quantum computing, glass is essential. Ultra-pure environments that cradle the delicate dance of qubits, the shimmering threads of tomorrow's digital universe. Yet, even as it embraces science and technology, glass remains a canvas for human creativity. Designers and artists have taken glass into the future, 3D printing it into sinuous shapes, carving it with laser precision, or weaving digital code into its glimmering surface. In their hands, glass becomes an expression of the eternal dance between fragility and strength, light and shadow, past and future. And perhaps most beautifully of all, for everything glass has become transparent technology, delicate art, silent energets, ancient soul still endures. We still seek out glass for the clarity it grants us, holding it to our eyes to see the world sharper, peering through it to bring distant visions closer. We still find a flicker of wonder in its shimmer, a sense of comfort in its cool, familiar weight. In glass, we see the alchemy of nature and mind dust, transformed by fire into something that captures the light of the sun and the flicker of a candle with equal grace. So where will this journey lead next? Maybe one day glass will be woven into the very fabric of our clothing, protecting and illuminating us in ways we can barely imagine. Maybe it will become an invisible partner in our thoughts, processing and reflecting the world around us as we move through it. Or maybe it will vanish altogether, transparent as air, reshaping our world while hiding in plain sight. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it will keep doing what it has always done, helping us to see more clearly, not just the world beyond our windows, but the world within us, the hopes we carry, the dreams we chase, and the quiet, glimmering possibility of transformation.